all of the facts, hear everything. I've been surprised at the Tea Parties that will hear one side of this issue, but then don't want to hear the other side. And if you're going to make an informed decision, you've got to have as much information at hand as possible. It's about the data. It's not personal. I don't have a bone to pick here tonight with Michael Ferris or the Middle Resolution or anyone else in particular. It's about the data. It's about the information. I don't think they're horrible people. I just think they're horribly wrong. And I hope that by the time I share a little bit with you tonight, you'll share that opinion as well. So without spending a whole lot of time, I'm going to try to go really, really quick so that we have time for question and answer, because I know you guys have got to be out of here by 8:30,
yeah,
right? So,
do you need the lights turned down?
oh yeah, it'd be great if you turn the lights down.
Is that enough? Do you want
Can everybody
that?
see that okay? Is that going to mess you up?
Which one?
Yeah,
Like
like
that.
that.
Leave it alone. Like that. Okay.
It's perfect. Okay. So
Hey, I'll flash.
Well,
No.
it's perfect for those who
And here we
want
go.
to take notes.
So let's get started, and first we're going to talk, I guess I'll turn this on, an amendments convention, solution, or seduction. And what is known, what the general term is constitutional convention, and it's known by a lot of names. I abbreviate it Con Con, that makes it simpler, and it kind of shares the idea that I don't think everything is completely above board with the idea of a constitutional convention in this modern age. I simply think having a modern day constitutional convention is extremely dangerous. I'm going to talk a little bit about why. It's also known as an amendments convention, convention of states, or Article 5 convention, but these are all one and the same event, a convention for the purpose of proposing amendments to the U.S. Constitution. So on the conservative side of the issue, we've got Mark Levin, author of the book, I think, Liberty Amendments, or Freedom, I think it's Liberty Amendments. And then groups like Convention of States, Compact for America, Balanced Budget Amendment Task Force, Middle Resolution, I think that's who you had out here. And you know what? If we stopped there, I would still be really concerned, but I wouldn't be nearly as concerned as when I look at the liberal side of the issue and the groups that are also working to bring about a modern-day constitutional convention. Groups like Wolfpack, Alliance for Democracy, Center for Media and Democracy, Code Pink, enough said, Independent Progressive Politics Network, Progressive Democrats of America, the Sierra Club, Vermont Single Taxpayer, MoveOn.org, Green Party, and the Occupy movement, all openly in favor of a modern-day constitutional convention. So the first question we need to ask ourselves is, do we really believe, have we any firm hope that when 3/4 of the states put in calls, 2/3 of the states put in calls for a constitutional convention, that only conservative, educated, politically educated, God-fearing patriots are going to be sitting down at the table to address what's wrong with our government? And the answer is simply no. So we say, it's okay though, because the stalwarts of conservatism are going to be there and they're not going to let this convention go in any bad direction. So then my return question to that is always, are we talking about the same people that accepted Obamacare money, these red states that accepted Obamacare, that accepted Bush's $700 billion bailout and the funds that came from that after they robbed the American people? I mean, I imagine everybody in this room raised a lot of cane about the bailouts. But these red state governments accepted bailout money. They cave on these issues. It's funny, every time conservatives and liberals sit down at the table, conservatives do all of the compromising. My father was just a common sense guy, and when I was real little, my father was very good with playing cards. When I was very little, he taught me a valuable lesson about poker. He said, son, when you sit down at the table to play poker, look around for the sucker. And if you can't spot him, put your money in your pocket and leave, because you're him. Okay? And I don't know if it is that conservatives haven't figured that out yet, or if maybe that's the game some of them are playing. I don't really care. All I know is that every time there's compromise made, it's always on our side of the issue and never on their side of the issue. So before we get any deeper, I want to look at the text of Article 5, because I will tell you, I need to be very honest with you, I am what you call an original constructionist. Amen. To me, it's about the language of the Constitution, because we on our side have all kicked up a lot of sand over the last, I don't know how many years, because progressives or liberals or socialists or whatever we want to call them read into the Constitution what they hope and wish was there, and then we claim that we're constitutionalists. But we need to be very careful that what we're looking at is actually the text of the Constitution as it's written. So I have shared, if everybody can see that, the Article 5 of the Constitution says, and I'm going to treat you like your children and read to you, not because I think you're children, but because there are some points that I want to make as I work my way through this. The Congress, whenever 2/3 of both houses shall deem it necessary, shall propose amendments to this Constitution, or on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states, shall call a convention for proposing amendments, which in either case shall be valid to all intents and purposes, as part of this Constitution when ratified by the legislatures of 3/4 of the several states, or by conventions in 3/4 thereof, as one or the other mode of ratification may be proposed by the Congress, provided that no amendment which may be made prior to the year 1808 shall in any manner affect the first and fourth clauses in the 9th section of the first article, and that no state without its consent shall be deprived of its equal suffrage in the Senate. Now, you all know this. You've read it because you're the kind of people who read this. You stay informed, you make sure you know what's going on. But I wanted to remind us of the text of this because I'm going to get really into the text of Article 5 and the different bodies that it creates and the power that each of those bodies has. So first let's start with state legislatures. Also Congress is mentioned in there, and the convention itself, which is its own entity, is mentioned in there. We're going to get into some others as we get a little further in. The Congress, on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the states, shall call a convention for proposing amendments. So the trick question here is, who applies for the convention? State legislatures. State legislatures have the power to apply for a convention. I keep hearing people talk about states calling a convention. States don't call the convention. States put in applications to Congress, and when 2/3 have put in the calls, Congress calls the convention. The Congress shall call a convention. So Congress calls the convention. The convention, Congress shall, and this is important because Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18 says, Congress shall have the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested in this Congress. So if Congress has the power to call the convention, whose convention is it? Congress. It's Congress's convention. So who makes the rules regarding the convention? Because some of the promises that are made, or some of the claims that are made by the people who are in favor of this, is that what we get is that the states get to set the rules, the states get to choose their delegates. I just read you the entire text of Article 5. It doesn't say that. I think they hope it, they wish it. But we need to be real constitutionalists and say, wait a minute, it doesn't say that. And Congress is not going to, heck, they won't abide by the Constitution and the words that are actually in there. They're not going to go out of their way to please us over something they don't have to. So Congress is going to make all laws for calling the convention. So when we pipe dream about who the delegates are going to be or what restrictions we'll be able to, last year in the legislative session, there was one bill before Congress that would have chosen the method for choosing delegates and what the delegates could and couldn't propose. I'm glad the bill failed, but it wouldn't have mattered had it passed. It only would have created confusion in the discussion. But in reality, at the end of all of it, Congress is going to do whatever they're going to do because they've been doing it anyway. They're not going to be bound by my will or your will or what any state legislature has said. Oh, our delegates can and can't do this, our delegates can and can't do that. Or these are going to be our delegates. We don't know what the process is going to be yet, and we're not going to know until that 34th state puts in their call. The Congress, on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states, shall call a convention for proposing amendments. Another trick question. Who proposes the amendments? The convention. And this is simple if you think about it in terms of something I'm going to get into in a moment, that there are two methods right now of ratifying amendments to the Constitution. One is that 3/4 of the state legislatures approve it, and the other is that special conventions are called in each state for ratifying the amendment. So what is the purpose of having a ratification convention if you decide ahead of time that you're only going to send people to the convention that are going to ratify? Then there is no real convention, it's just a rubber stamping committee. Okay, so a convention that is already sent there with their marching orders to say, here are the amendments, is not really a convention. It's a committee. Well, this isn't a committee, this is a convention. Conventions get to propose amendments. Else there's no reason to ever have a convention. We've already got the amendments we want, now let's just start the ratification process. So it is the convention, according to Article 5 of the Constitution, that proposes the amendments. What would those amendments be? Who knows? Which shall be valid to all intents and purposes as part of this Constitution when ratified by the legislatures of 3/4 of the several states. So we get that the state legislatures have the power over ratification method number 1, or by conventions in 3/4 thereof. So we create a brand new entity now, ratification conventions, that have the power over ratification method number 2. Okay? But wait. So Congress gets to select ratification method number 1 or 2, as one or the other mode of ratification may be proposed by Congress. I'm watching Congress's powers really stack up here, okay? Now here's where it really gets interesting. There is the possibility that the convention could create an entirely new ratification process, yet unknown. Where do I get that from? Article 13 of the Articles of Confederation, under which every delegate to the Constitutional Convention was under, when he went to that convention, says, "Nor shall any alteration at any time hereafter be made to any of them," the Articles of Confederation, "unless such alteration be agreed to in a Congress of the United States and be afterward confirmed by the legislatures of every state." So, going into the Constitutional Convention, they were there to propose amendments to the Articles of Confederation, which would have required the approval of Congress and every state legislature. Any state could blackball any amendment. So what did they do? They said, well, here's our new Constitution. Oh, and by the way, the ratification of the conventions of 9 states shall be sufficient for the establishment of this Constitution. They changed the ratification method. I'm glad they did, by the way. I'm not, I've been in, I don't know, a dozen or more Michael Ferris's speeches and meetings where he accuses everyone who disagrees with him on this issue of being an enemy of the Constitution and accusing our founding fathers of writing a fraud document, of running away with more authority than they had. That's not ever what I've said. I've never heard any of my friends say that. What we say is that they had a very specific written list of instructions, and they went beyond that very specific list of written instructions. Did they have the strictest legal authority to do so? I don't know. I know they had the moral authority to do so. The Declaration of Independence says that any people anywhere who see that their government is destructive toward their means of happiness has not only the right but the duty to overthrow that government and enact a new form of government more likely to affect their happiness. What did our founding fathers do in 1787? They said the Articles of Confederation are never going to work. We need to do something different, and they did something different. But folks, this isn't 1787. Who's George Washington today? Who's Alexander Hamilton? I would take an Alexander Hamilton right now, thank you. But we don't have anyone like that. Who are we going to get? Nancy Pelosi? George Bush? Jeb? Help me. I mean, I could use a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel here. So we could wind up with an entirely new ratification method that we don't know. What could it be? They could just say, well, if Congress approves it, if the president signs off on it, they could say anything, and guess what? It would be legitimate because we told them to call the convention. So let's look at claims of the advocates of a convention. They say states can bypass Congress in this amendment process with a convention of states, which they refuse to call a constitutional convention, and I'll get into that in a moment. States can bypass Congress in the amendment process. But I'm looking at the powers of Congress in this. They call the convention, they make the rules for the convention, and they get to select ratification method number 1 or number 2. Are we bypassing Congress, or is this Congress's party, and we're just telling them to send out the invitations? Okay, so that I think we can take that one off the board. The states can propose amendments. Well, if we're going to be constitutionalists, we have to be honest with the fact that the Constitution says that Congress, the convention, proposes the amendments. States don't propose the amendments. They say states can make the rules for calling a convention. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18 says Congress has the authority to make the rules for anything that they have the authority to do. If they have the authority to call the convention, then they have the authority to make the rules for the convention. And they know that, by the way, and I'm going to get into that. They say, and this is my favorite, it's not a constitutional convention, but much more limited in power. Now, I'm going to address these in reverse order. Much more limited in power. Let's look at the constitutionally defined limits placed on what a convention can and cannot discuss what can and cannot be amended. Provided that no amendment which may be made prior to the year 1808 shall in any manner affect the first and fourth clauses in the 9th section of the first article, dealing with the importation of slavery. Do we still do that? Okay, so we'll just go ahead and take that one off the board, because since they can't discuss it, they won't be discussing it anyway, because we're on the other side of 1808 now, so that one's removed. Okay? And that no state without its consent shall be deprived of its equal suffrage in the Senate. The 17th Amendment drove a stake through the heart of equal suffrage in the Senate, so we may as well not even get into that. And by the way, we need to repeal the 17th Amendment and have state legislatures appointing senators to represent the states. I already have a representative in the House. I don't need a representative in the Senate, but my state government sure does. Okay, let's go back to being a republic again.
Amen.
But neither here nor there, because they're not going to be discussing that since Article 5 says they can't. So what else can they not discuss? Can they discuss,
Repealing the Second Amendment.
can they just, no, that pesky Bill of Rights. That thing is forever more a thorn in our flesh. Let's just get, you know what, let's just write a whole new Constitution. Is there anything in the Constitution that says they can't do that? No, these are the only two things they can't discuss, and everything else is on the table. By the way, both of these things have timed out on us, so to speak. So actually, they can discuss anything now.
So it's a free-for-all.
So now let's look at the definition of a constitutional convention, because they prefer the term Convention of States or Article 5 Convention or Amendments Convention or anything but Constitutional Convention. They really despise that phrase. And I've personally been accused of fear-mongering because I call it a constitutional convention. So let's take a look for a moment. Black's Law Dictionary is the law dictionary in the United States of America. It is cited by attorneys left and right in Supreme Court cases and lower cases. They use it when preparing briefs. This is where legal definitions come from. I am sure that Michael Ferris owns at least a copy of Black's Law Dictionary. And if not, he can email me at cmitchellshaw@gmail.com and tell me that he doesn't own one, and I'll take that part out of my presentation. But I'll be sure to tell everybody that he doesn't own one. So, what does it say a constitutional convention is? And you can look this up online. Black's Law Dictionary is available free on the internet. A constitutional convention is, quote, a duly constituted assembly of delegates or representatives of the people of a state or a nation for the purpose of framing, revising, or amending its constitution. So what is an amendments convention? It's a constitutional convention. What authority does it have? Well, let's see. It can frame, revise, or amend constitutions. So it's not much more limited in power, and it is a constitutional convention. Why they claim it is not when it so clearly is beyond me. They say state voting power will be one state, one vote. I just read you the entire text of Article 5. It doesn't say that. What it does say is that Congress calls the convention, and since Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18 says Congress has the authority to make the rules for that, believe it or not, in this one, Congress is not negligent in their duty. Referring to the 41 bills which have already been introduced by Congress, apportionment, now this is according to the Congressional Research Services, apportionment of convention delegates among the states was generally set at the formula provided for the Electoral College, with each state assigned an equal number to its combined Senate and House delegations. So it's just like the Electoral College, meaning that a large state like California is going to have a lot more votes than a smaller state like Virginia. Are you comfortable with that? Because I'm not comfortable with it. California, just saying. So state voting power will be one state, one vote. That's off the board. It's just not, it doesn't bear up under scrutiny. What are the other dangers of a constitutional convention? Unintended consequences. So let's talk about this for a second. The 14th Amendment. Did it need to be written? Did it need to be enacted? Did it need to be ratified? I would say yes. When you look at the reason that all those things were done. The war between the states is over. Slaves are freed, thank God. Okay? Slaves are freed, and they are equal citizens. So we need an amendment that says that just because somebody wasn't considered a full citizen of the United States yesterday because he was a slave, Today, he's a free citizen and he has all of the rights that everybody else has. That's all it was ever intended to mean. Today, it means that if Consuela makes it on this side of the Rio Grande before her water breaks, little Jorge is an American citizen. How that gets read into that is beyond me. Or for that matter, if Tiffany's here on vacation from England when her water breaks, little George is a U.S. citizen. This is insanity. That is not what was intended.
No other country does that.
No other country does that because other countries aren't retarded. And that gets me into judicial redefining, which is how the 14th Amendment got in the mess that it's in. But how many other amendments have gotten into this mess? By the way, I have asked a question several times of Mr. Ferris when he's speaking, and he talks about these amendments that they've already lined up, and here's what we're going to do. We're going to reel this in, we're going to rein that in, we're going to close this off, we're going to build that up. And my hand goes up, and because the guy with the microphone doesn't know not to give me the microphone, I get to keep asking this question. And the question is, what magic language are you going to write these amendments in that is going to compel a body of men and women that today ignore language as clear as Congress shall make no law? What is clearer than Congress shall make no law that you're going to write into your amendments that suddenly they will go, darn, he just didn't leave us any wiggle room? I never get an answer because there's not one. To be fair, Mr. Ferris's answer is that only older amendments and older portions of the Constitution are so misconstrued today because the language is older and it's kind of lost its meaning. Newer amendments are followed correctly. Well, again, let's just go back to Congress shall make no law. How many ways are there to interpret that? If you're a real, honest, thinking person, Congress shall make no law. But how many laws do we have about those 5 things about which Congress can make no law? We have free speech zones. And if you're outside the free speech zone, forget your free speech, though Congress can make no law abridging free speech. They do it anyway. They turn to the Second Amendment, okay, that says that I have the right to keep and bear arms and that it shall not be infringed. I think this is even stronger language than Congress shall make no law. And then they look at that amendment and they say, well, we need to make some gun laws. And since it's right there in the Constitution, we can do it. They're not misunderstanding the language, folks. They're just liars and thieves. Undisclosed, intended consequences. Speaking of liars and thieves, the 16th and 17th Amendments. Those were sold to us as, here's what it's going to do, when really all along, here's what it does. And we bought it. We ratified it. If indeed we ratified it, and now we're stuck with it, 16th and 17th Amendments. So what's the root of the problem? Is it flaws in the Constitution? Typically when I'm out and about and in my bag I keep a little pocket copy of the Constitution. These discussions will come up and somebody will say, I'll say, well, why do we need to amend the Constitution? Well, something's got to be done, they'll say. I agree, but why do we need to amend the Constitution? And I'll hand them my pocket copy of the Constitution, and I'll say, can you show me the flaws in this document that need to be addressed? No. It is that, well, they're not abiding by it. Well, how is changing it going to fix that? If my teenager stays out past her curfew, I don't then say, well, what do you think your curfew ought to be? I just take the keys and send her to the room. I'm hard like that. Okay? Is it ignoring the Constitution? You know what? That's part of it. That is part of it. But why does our government ignore the Constitution? Because of ignorance of the Constitution.
Republican.
Because in your neighborhood, and in your church, and at your job, and sometimes in our mirrors, there is ignorance of the Constitution. And it is up to us to inform and educate ourselves about the Constitution and the principles behind it and how it came about being framed and what the words in the Constitution mean. And I am sick to death of hearing that the Constitution is difficult to understand. It's an hour's worth of reading. There are like 5 words in there that have fallen out of use, and you can Google them. This isn't difficult. Folks, I'm being a little silly, but I'm serious. The Constitution is not written in some strange foreign tongue that only the guys in black robes can interpret. It's just not like that. Thomas Jefferson said, if a nation expects to be ignorant and free, it expects what never was and never will be. Let me posit to you that we are breaking a spiritual principle. The principle says people have the government they deserve. frankly, I think we have better government than we deserve, because go out and start asking questions of your neighbors. Just ask them simple things like, what form of government do we have in America? How many branches does our federal government have? If the president and vice president both die in a plane wreck,
Who's next, John?
no, I got hung up on that, I'm sorry. Let me move on. Who would be president? You know, your neighbor doesn't know that. There's the problem. That our Constitution was framed for a people, it's a document, folks. It's not going to defend itself. You have to. And the problem is, Convention of States comes in, and you know, the Middle Resolution comes in, and all these pro-Con Con groups come in, like they're going to save the day. And if you're sitting around waiting for a hero, you're doing it wrong. Be the hero. It's you. You are the hero. If America's going to be saved, you are going to do it. You're going to educate yourself. You're going to educate your friends and family. You're going to educate your neighbor. Even your brother-in-law, yeah, educate him, okay? Get him to understand. Because Thomas Jefferson also said to educate and inform the whole mass of the people, they are the only sure reliance for the preservation of our liberty. In another statement similar to this, he said, if we think them not informed enough, the answer is not to take from them their freedom, but to inform them, okay? So now let's talk about what is the answer? How do we fix it? What really will do this? Again, Thomas Jefferson. This is in the Kentucky Resolutions. When dealing with the Alien and Sedition Acts, both of which were unconstitutional, Thomas Jefferson's response and how to deal with those was very simple. He said, where powers are assumed which have not been delegated, a nullification of the act is the rightful remedy. So many people want to poo-poo the idea of state nullification of unconstitutional laws. Let me ask you, is an unconstitutional law even really a law? Is a state obliged to obey a law that is not constitutional when the federal government is attempting to trump the states in an area where the federal government has no authority? Thomas Jefferson went on to say, every state has a natural right in cases not within the compact, the Constitution itself, to nullify of their own authority all assumptions of power by others within their limits. So whatever, and the answer, by the way, comes again from the Constitution, the 10th Amendment. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. In clear language, if the federal government has not an enumerated power to do a certain thing, it is at the most a state's power. If the people haven't given that power to the states, it's reserved to the people. This is very simple. So when you get these unconstitutional laws, and I can't think of any off the top of my head, or Obamacare, okay? So what do we do with Obamacare? Nullify it. The state legislature needs to man up and say, you know what, we're just going to do this. We're going to say what everybody knows. It's not the law. I know the Supreme Court says it is, but they were wrong too. Because believe it or not, sometimes the 9 high priests in their black robes, the Nazgul, I call them for all you Lord of the Rings nerds out there, okay? They're wrong, okay? They're wrong. And they were wrong. When Obamacare came up, you know, we told people there are really only 3 or 4 possible ways to deal with it. Repeal it. I like that. Well, I'm going to work my way up the scale. So we're going to start with the ones I didn't like. Defund it. Okay, that's a Band-Aid.
It's still a law.
Because then another Congress comes along and just refunds it, okay? And so then repeal it. Okay, we could repeal it. I like repeal, okay? We could, and I like this one better, nullify. Or let the Supreme Court decide on it. They said, let the Supreme Court. And the objection was, but you know what? What if they decide against us? Then the whole world is going to say, but the Supreme Court said. Guess what, guys? The Supreme Court said it. And they're still wrong. So the only option left to us is nullify it. I'm okay with repeal. I like repeal, but I prefer nullify, because once a state legislature does this, on the very next day they realize, hey, we did that. And then all they've got to do is just start working their way back through about 100 years of unconstitutional laws, repealing or nullifying them. Nullification puts the power back in the states where it belongs, unless Thomas Jefferson was just off his nut. Okay? So the Constitution is the solution. States should enforce it, not revise it. If the Constitution isn't to blame, why are we blaming the Constitution? Why do we want to change the Constitution? You know what needs to be amended? Our government. Now, that is it for me. I am willing to take questions, and I've got about 15 minutes.
No, we got more time than that.
Okay. Well, I'll get tired after 15 minutes, so let's just... Yes, sir.
On the 2/3 versus 3/4.
Okay.
At that time, weren't there only 13 colonies?
That's right.
And so, I'm trying to think now, the percentage-wise, 9 of the 13,
3/4.
that's 3/4.
Right.
So, it makes it very difficult to change things. And I'm trying to understand why the 2/3 was even there versus the
Okay,
75%.
So ratification requires 3/4. Ratification requires 3/4, but to put in a call for a constitutional convention only requires 2/3. An interesting point on that, by the way, is that 2/3 of the 50 states is 34. Everybody could do the math. So when the John Birch Society, whom I worked for a number of years, began talking about this in the 70s and 80s after the Balanced Budget Amendment had gained so much traction, and a lot of states were putting in calls for a constitutional convention. How many states do you think we were up to by the time that process began to reverse? We need 34. We have 32.
Yes.
32. We were 2 states away. And I tell people that, and until this new round of this game came up, people would look at me like, wow, and I go, what, Rush Limbaugh didn't tell you that? Or Sean Hannity, they don't tell you. Media was not talking about this in the 70s and 80s. It was completely behind the veil. And we were 2 states away from a constitutional convention. So what the John Birch Society did was we put together a DVD with state legislators and scholars in constitutional matters talking about the fact that there's no way to, first of all, there's no way to rein in a runaway convention. We could absolutely have a runaway convention. There's nothing we could do about it, okay? Because, and then the other one I like is, I forget what state it was that just wanted to build into their call for a constitutional convention that if they don't like the way it's going, they can recall their delegates and close the convention. It doesn't work that way. It's like, gosh, you know, I just pulled the trigger and realized that's my dog instead of a deer. I want to call that bullet back. Well, go ahead, call it. It's not going to answer. So we could try to call the convention back after it's begun. And then another interesting point to keep in mind is that, again, as I said, this isn't 1787, and CNN and C-SPAN are going to be there live now. Everybody's going to be Twittering and Facebooking like from their phones while this is going on. It's going to be a frenzy. And every special interest group is going to demand representation in this. Folks, if we do this, we are pulling a pin from a grenade and throwing it on over our shoulders as we walk out the room. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
So once it's called, it's ollie oxen.
Oh, yeah.
That just frees up every single rule.
Yeah, so let's go back to 1787 for a second. The New York delegation rightly said, wait a minute, this goes beyond anything that we were given the authority to do. We're leaving. And they left, all except for Hamilton, who was not able to vote because he didn't have quorum. There weren't enough people there for him to cast a vote. So New York didn't actually cast a vote as to whether to approve the Constitution the way it was written. Now, of course, when it went out for ratification, it was ratified, which is great. You know, frankly, I think it's the finest document penned by man. I think it's great. I think that, you know, barring divine inspiration, you're not going to do better than the U.S. Constitution as far as a form of government goes. Why would we mess with it? I'm glad they did what they did, but that ship has sailed, folks. We're not going to pull that off again. In fact, less than 20 years, two years after the Constitutional Convention, there was talk about having another one, and all the Founding Fathers knew. We can never do this. Miracles do not cluster, so we just better not. Yes, sir.
You mentioned correcting ignorance, educating the people, and it's
Absolutely.
an important remedy. I couldn't agree more. What is your plan for doing that?
Well, okay, the plan for educating the people is really very simple, actually. You're doing a lot of it right here, right now. Can you probably do it better? Sure, we all can. There's a tree. It's called the Chinese bamboo tree. And it's this little sliver of bamboo that you plant. and it's about this big when you put it in the ground, and then you water it, and because it's bamboo, you water it some more, and then a whole bunch more. And a year later, it's grown about that much, so now it's like this, and you're like, wow, that was worth it. And then so you do that again for a year, and it grows about that much again, and it does this year after year, and about the time you're thinking, screw this, I'm plucking that thing up, it's not worth the water I'm putting into it. The 6th or 7th year, it grows over 20 feet tall within that year. You can almost measure the growth by the minute. Because what you can't see that's been happening, folks, is that those 7 years, it knew the wind was going to blow on it. It knew that people were going to bump up against it and animals were going to run past it. So there was this taproot growing down way deep into the ground and a root system spreading out across the yard so that it can stand in the wind. Then it shoots up. What you've been doing is working. You don't see the results yet and you think, man, I'm tired of this. I've been doing this for fill in the blank. Scripture tells us, do not be weary in well-doing, for you shall reap a harvest in due season if you do not faint. The answer for how to inform the electorate, the nuts and bolts of it, is really simple. Books, DVDs, host parties in your home, invite people over, do something really fun, and in the middle of it, show them a 15-minute video. Keep it short. Get them interested. If you just hand an ignorant person a book, he's just going to prop his stool up with it, okay? But if you get him interested in the subject matter and hand him a book, he'll read it.
Well, as a follow-up, how many people in this room have ever taught their neighbors the Constitution in their living rooms? Besides,
Pocket copies of the Constitution can be bought for as little as 50 cents.
well, here I'm not willing to wait 7 years for the bamboo to take
No,
off.
you've been doing it, is my point.
I teach the Constitution. I have a class starting this next Monday in Newport News. I handed out 180 door-to-door flyers within 2 blocks of the classroom we're going to be using.
How many people do you have coming?
I got 3 responses out of 180 flyers.
Okay.
I have a total of 5 people in the class.
Do it in a different neighborhood.
Teaching 5 people at a time is not going to get us where we need to go.
It
No.
takes 3% to make change or anything. Out of
No, I
100
agree.
people,
Well,
3%.
where are the rest of the teachers of the Constitution
So
that
find
are going to be
another
needed to pull this off?
Find another method. Invite people into your home for a party. Don't tell them it's about the Constitution.
I'm not going to do that.
We meet every week.
I'll tell them it's a Tupperware party.
It's called
That's
the
right.
9/12 meeting. But we've
So-
been doing this for
So
4 years.
buy 100 copies, pocket copies of the Constitution, and go knock on all your neighbors' doors and just give them a copy of it. If nothing but curiosity, people will read the thing. You know, the first time I read the Constitution, I was 13 years old because a member of the John Birch Society walked up to me on the street in Phoenix City, Alabama, and asked me if I'd ever read the Constitution. I said, no. And so he handed me one, and I read it. And I thought, well, this stuff, I think I was 15, I was 16 years old. I thought, this doesn't look anything like our government today. Like anything. Yes, sir, in the back.
Couple of questions. First off, every time we hear something being spoken about nullification, first thing that jumps up is, oh, you can't do that because of the supremacy clause, and there's been some supposedly some court action on that. How's that going to work?
Yes, so let's talk about the Supremacy Clause, which essentially says that the Constitution is the law of the land. The Constitution is the law of the land, not unconstitutional bills that are passed. So if Obamacare is not constitutional, it's not the law of the land. And again, Thomas Jefferson was addressing, I imagine everyone here is familiar with the Alien and Sedition Acts. Okay, so Thomas Jefferson was addressing the 2 most weighty laws on the books in America 7 years after the Constitution was drafted. And he says the answer is to just nullify them. Inform the federal government that Kentucky is not going to participate, and Virginia is not going to participate, and North Carolina is not going to participate. So let's go back to Obamacare then. How national is national health care if a half a dozen states aren't doing it? It falls apart under its own weight, which it's going to do anyway. Okay, it's unsustainable. Just do the math. Free health care is going to kill us. Okay, financially, if not medically. Okay, so nullify it in a handful of states, as each state does that, other states are empowered to do it, then it, and again, I'm not selling a pro-marijuana position, but this is exactly what states are doing with medical marijuana, and some states are doing it with marijuana across the board. I mean, Colorado, are federal troops marching in the streets in Colorado, yanking joints out of hippies' mouths? No. Are they going to?
Nullified the
No.
NDAA.
Yeah. It can absolutely be done. We don't have, one last point on that, we don't have a national ID in America, real ID, not because states formally nullified it, they just refused to do it. They just refused to take on the burden and de facto nullified it. It's got to be done, it can be done, it's perfectly constitutional.
You know,
Yes, sir.
Can you comment on a treaty versus a constitution?
Oh, wow. And that's pretty far afield for this discussion, but I'll make it very simple. A treaty is a treaty, and the Constitution is the Constitution. Treaties are not the law of the land at the same weight that a Constitution, that the Constitution is the law of the land, and I can prove that very simply. Look what it takes to amend the Constitution. Why would we ever amend the Constitution if we could make those sweeping changes by treaty? We just have a treaty with a nation that said that nobody in America can own a gun, and then we wouldn't own guns.
How do they end up using that as an
Yeah.
argument?
The same way that they will ignore Congress shall make no law because they're liars and thieves and we keep falling for
And
it.
who is it that's saying that?
Who is it that's saying that?
Yeah.
Left and right. They both treat
Legislative.
treaties like they have the weight of the Constitution. They're the law of the land. Yes, ma'am.
So in this nullification, like for instance Obamacare, are you saying that the state legislatures would have to vote on it?
Yes.
Okay, and so it would take just a majority?
A majority in both houses, that's right. And so nullification could happen in how many legislative sessions?
One.
So when I look at something like the Convention of States, they're saying, of course, that their numbers keep getting shorter and shorter, but I think right now, Carrie, they're saying, what, 7 years for Convention of States?
Says 2 to 7 years.
2 to 7 years.
Now they're saying it might
Okay.
happen this year.
So let's make it in one legislative or 2 legislative sessions. Let's just start nullifying unconstitutional laws, because that is the answer. The book I would recommend, by the way, is Nullification, written by Tom Woods. If you've not read it, you really need to. It's a very, very fun read. He goes into a lot of interesting historical documents and facts and tells some great stories in there, and Tom Woods is just he really knows what he's talking about. He's a good, solid, thinking person.
Do you have this posted on YouTube, Reed?
In fact, it's being videoed tonight and it's going to go up on YouTube. But if you, the first Tea Party where I presented this was the Henrico Tea Party. The presentation was about this different. I've added a couple of slides since then. But if you Google Mitchell Shaw Henrico Tea Party, it'll be one of the first things that comes up. It's like over an hour long, which is why I really try to keep it short tonight. Carrie, we just put up a website. It's defendnotchange.com. If you want more information, go to defendnotchange.com. And it's under construction right now, so it's not as slick as it's going to be, but there's still some good information on it. Yes, sir, further in the back.
So I just like to hear why you think the word call a convent or call for calling a convention in Article 5 also means under the necessary and proper clause means everything surrounding that. The
Okay.
strict definition
Sure.
under Webster, if you go to Noah Webster's dictionary of 1826,
Okay.
call does not mean anything near
No.
what you
No,
say.
call doesn't mean that. Now, I'm not
Right.
saying the word call means that.
Okay.
What I'm saying is that Congress calls the convention.
Right.
I think we have to agree on that because that's what the text of the Constitution says.
Clearly.
Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18 says that whatever Congress is given authority to do, they have the authority to make the laws and rules
So on the one
regarding
hand, you
it.
agree with me, on the other hand, you disagree with me.
No.
The calling is all they have authority to do.
No.
Necessary and
No.
proper
No,
is
it's
calling
not.
a convention.
No, it's
Well, why
not.
do you say that?
Because someone has to make the invitation list. Someone has to say where the convention's going to be. Someone has to say how long the convention can
Okay.
last. Someone has to say what the convention's going to discuss. If Congress calls the convention, it's Congress's convention.
It's
And
not.
Article 1, Section 18.
That's your interpretation.
Well, it is my interpretation, but it's not my interpretation alone. It's Congress's interpretation. It's Congress's interpretation in the 41 bills they've already introduced to say how they're going to structure an Article 5 convention,
Nice.
not if, but when we hold one.
Right?
That's not, they're going to do it. Now, you and I can go back and forth and
Sure,
play
but the
mental
states
ping pong
don't have
about
to
what they're
follow
gonna
that
do.
either. All they have to do is accept that the mandatory shall means they must, and then that's it, and they call it. After that, the states can do what they want.
No, sir. No,
Yes.
sir. Not according
Yes.
to the necessary and proper
Sorry,
clause,
that
which
doesn't
says that
apply.
whatever Congress can
It
do,
does
they have the
not
authority to
apply.
make the rules regarding it.
No.
Why can they make laws and rules if they can't make laws and rules regarding the convention if they have the authority to call the
Again,
convention?
unconstitutional versus constitutional. That's what we're talking about.
Well, but that is what we're talking about,
Yes,
and
it
they do
is.
it all the time. Yes, sir.
Well, the way I read that, it said, the states have the authority to make an application.
That's it.
That's all they could,
That,
that's all they're entitled to do.
states apply.
Yeah, no say.
States
And
apply.
again,
And they receive.
uh,
No. Well,
that's
yes,
the 10th
yes.
Amendment then.
So the new
Comes
question
up.
is, can states rescind previous calls for a constitutional convention? And the answer is, until we have a convention, the answer is yes.
Well, that's up in the air.
Because, well, but most legal scholars are now saying, or they're looking at just the language and saying, okay, if all we've done is apply for a convention, and the convention has not been called, then we can withdraw our application. Because that's all it is an application. Otherwise, it's just a doomsday clock ticking away. Eventually, there are going to be 2/3 of the state. Because all it's ever going to take is, okay guys, the very next state that puts in a call, it's done. Nobody can rescind. And the other evidence that they can rescind is the fact that we've not already had a convention. Because if you add up all of the calls that have been put in the 200 some odd years that the Constitution's been in effect, it's considerably more than 2/3 of the states that have put in calls. It's like, I don't know, three halves. It's nearly every state, because states have put in calls twice and then rescinded them. One interesting point on that is there was, and I can't remember the name now of the document, that several states in the 1940s, so right after the launch of the United Nations, 9 states put in, several states voted on it, 9 states actually approved this and put in calls for a constitutional convention. And just Google this yourselves, or you can go to the Virginia Stop a Con Con Facebook page and find the document on that page. If you're on Facebook, just up in the bar, type Virginia Stop a Con Con, and it'll come up. And it calls for a constitutional convention to amend the Constitution to be more in keeping with world government. 9 states put that on the books. One of them's North Carolina. It's still on the books. They've never rescinded it. So there's a big move right now to get states, and Virginia's done this. How long ago was it, Carrie?
2004.
2004. Virginia rescinded all previous calls for a constitutional convention.
What about 14 of them?
What's really damning is that a goodly number of the legislators who voted for that, and if you read the bill, it says that it's dangerous, can't be reined in, we need not to do this. A goodly number of the legislators that voted for that are now the very ones not only voting for, but sponsoring bills for a convention of states, Article 5 convention, Constitution, call it whatever you want to. It's the same animal.
Scott Langenfeld
What's
is
the
one of them,
website
he hates the UN.
Defendnotchange.com. Defendnotchange.com. And then on Facebook, it's you just go up into the search bar and type in Virginia Stop a Con Con. And that page has not been greatly updated because I've been busy. But the information that's on it's still very good. It's just, there's not a lot of real
But
current
someone we
stuff.
can direct is on Facebook.
Yeah, absolutely.
You can also Google.
Yes, sir.
You answered some of my questions, but what it has to deal with is the applications. You'd mentioned at one time for the balanced budget amendment.
That's right.
There have been 32 applications.
That's right.
My question is, since the Constitution has been instated, I'm sure there's been more
Hundreds.
than
Hundreds of calls.
applications.
Or applications, I apologize. Hundreds
One
of
of the
applications.
questions, I read 2 letters. One was a letter to the House of Representatives. And the answer that came back to that letter was from the House Counsel. And what it pertained to, the question the person was asking was how many states, what is the count of the number of states that have applications in right now? The council come back and said the House clerk does not have any directions to count how many applications are in. So currently the applications are 0. So my question is there a statute of limitations on these 800? So if they're,
No, but
why,
but many of those applications have been made and then rescinded. So they're no longer in effect.
So-
You know, it's similar to if you were to say, well, I'm going to go buy a house. And you go through all the process of having the house inspected, and then you begin the mortgage loan application process, and then you decide, you know what, I'm not going to buy this house after all, so I really don't need that mortgage, and I'm going to withdraw my application to apply. They're not going to mail the seller the check anyway and still tell you that you owe the money. You rescinded your application. And this is, I'm oversimplifying it, but it's similar enough to that. We're applying, and then we're saying, you know, after all, we don't want to apply. And since we've not held a convention yet, we're just going to take our name off the books, and now we don't want one. And so that's not counted.
so out of the 900, there's never been any point in time?
There have been 2/3 at one time, no.
Wow.
And I think that is very fortunate. I can take one more question, Carrie.
Aren't there 3 states that have adopted the Wolf Pack application?
Yes.
And hasn't Hawaii asked for an application, I don't know if they passed it, but they want to remove the Second Amendment or change its language?
Yes. That's
That's
where
all
we
I
are,
have for
folks.
you.
What we're dealing with here is not a world where the Tea Party is going to be sitting down trying to figure out what's wrong with America.
No.
No, we're going to be sitting down across the table from the very people that have been stripping away our national sovereignty, stripping away our God-given rights, and we're going to hand them a piece of paper and a pen and the authority to do pretty much whatever they want to do. So the great argument that I can, to do the math, they say. There are more red states than there are blue states. Well, then why are we having this conversation? If that's the solution, why are we even talking about this? Well, because there's a problem. But wait, there can't be a problem. There are more red states than blue states. That's not the answer. Because how many of those red states took Obamacare money? How many of those red states took bailout money? How many of those red states, even in their own state legislatures, are forevermore enacting laws that are contrary to the liberty of the inhabitants of those states, and very often in direct violation of their own state constitutions? It happens all the time. So the fact that there are more red states than blue states doesn't make me sleep any better. Because folks, this isn't red versus blue. This is not Republicans versus Democrats. I remember when I had my epiphany, and I know this is going up on YouTube, so I'm going to shock some people. My epiphany came the day I realized that I could vote for a Democrat if he was a constitutionalist. A guy like, I don't know, Larry McDonald back in the day. I would absolutely vote for a Democrat. And then I would chuckle all the way home because I never thought that would happen. Okay? Because it's not about political parties. It's not red versus blue. It's us versus them. The answer is to inform yourselves, inform your neighbors. If the method you're using to inform your neighbors isn't working, find another method. But keep doing it. Get better at it. Yes, ma'am.
The answer also has to be to get our elected representatives to abide by the Constitution.
Or throw them out.
But how many times have we heard, we know it's unconstitutional, but yet they get reelected?
Instead of us.
That's right. So, yes, sir.
Would you say the object of the opposition is basically just to destroy the country?
No.
What do they want?
No, I'm not saying that.
No, I'm not saying it.
Yeah,
You're saying,
yeah,
but isn't that their goal?
I want to be. So the question for everybody who may not have heard it was: then is the object of people who are in favor of a constitutional
No,
convention?
I mean those that want to change it the way we don't want it changed.
Oh, Barack Obama wants to destroy the nation.
Yes.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. Boehner wants to destroy the nation. Yeah, the powers that be and have been in power for all this time absolutely want to
Do
destroy
we know
this
why
nation.
they want to destroy it?
They want to keep
because they're communists
Obama wants a
and
one-world
socialists
nation.
and bleeding heart liberals and one world governmentalists because they want world government, and you can't have a sovereign United States in the middle of a solid one world government. And this really is, I'm a liar, I've said last question every time, but this is it.
Isn't there a parental rights amendment in this whole thing that you're trying to accomplish also?
Okay, so I've said this several times. While I principally disagree with Michael Ferris, I don't want anything that I say here tonight to be taken as an attack on him personally, or I'm not going after his character. But the facts are what they are, and he's wrong on this issue. This isn't the only issue he's wrong on. He is the father of parentalrights.org, which is an organization that ostensibly wants to protect your parental rights against the UN Convention on the Rights of a Child by granting, by way of a federal amendment, an amendment to the U.S. Constitution, the power to the federal government to define your rights as a parent. That's all you ever have to tell anybody, and they're against it. It's so funny. And he says it, but he says it different, and people are for it. But then you get them to stop and think for a moment. The federal government gets to define your rights as a parent. You lost me at federal government. So, so it appears that Michael Ferris suffers from a malady that he thinks that the lowest level of solving any problem is at the federal level. And I disagree with him. And it comes down to the way he interprets the 14th Amendment as trumping the 10th Amendment, and I see the 10th Amendment as trumping the 14th Amendment if there's ever disparity between them. So, that is it. Thank you all.
Thank you.